This is Twit.
Joining me right now is the author of this book, Console Wars, Blake J. Harris. It is the story that begins in 1990 of Sega, Nintendo, and as he says, the battle that shaped a generation. Sega. I have that burnt into my brain. Sega.
That's Tom Kalinski's fault.
Whose fault?
Tom Kalinski.
Okay, so this is really, in many ways, Tom Kalinski's story. He's fighting Nintendo, the evil empire. In 1990, Nintendo was actually, and we should even say this is the second era of video gaming you're talking about here, because it really began in the late 70s with Atari, when it was Atari, Mattel, Coleco, fighting it out with these very primitive 8-bit games. I mean, we've shown, everybody's looked at E.T. because that's been in the news lately, and you look at it and you go, how could people possibly have thought this was entertaining? But it's really not much different than Pong. You know, you have some very simple 8-bit sounds, very simple 8-bit sprites. You couldn't really do very much. And in fact, that era crashed and burned, probably due to Atari really screwing it up by allowing a lot of crappy games onto the market, and people got burned and said never again, and that was it. And Nintendo came back maybe 10 years later and created the second era of video gaming. That's my memory. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And that's something that, you know, as a kid, I had no idea. I knew that Nintendo was the market leader. They were the Coke to Sega's Pepsi, but I didn't realize that they had 90 or 95% of this market. You know, I knew they were ahead, but I didn't realize how dominant they were. And also, you know, as much as the story, at least in the first half, dubs as a David and Goliath story with Sega, led by Tom Kalinski and Sonic the Hedgehog trying to slay this beast, that 5 years earlier, Nintendo was their own David and Goliath story, trying to resurrect the video game industry after that Atari crash. And so it was really interesting and creative for a very unique dynamic where I would say there's no heroes and no villains, though each company would claim that the other was the bad guy. And it was just two different philosophies going head to head, and really sending ripples to every facet you can imagine, every part of the culture, from, you know, kids on the schoolyards to Congress to boardrooms. And it really had a huge ripple effect.
I do remember in fact, I think I've interviewed David Sheff, who wrote Game Over, which was the Nintendo story. So that story has been somewhat told, but the Sega story hasn't. And I'm glad you kind of picked that particular battle, a battle which Sega surprisingly did very well in for this book, because it really is almost so much. It's almost you liken it to the Red Sox and the Yankees. It's almost the plucky little Red Sox, you know, facing off against the murderer's row. So where did Tom Kalinski come from?
So Tom Kalinski, you know, speaking with Tom was what really crystallized this project for me, because that he is what initially gave me a face. You know, before that, it was just these big, faceless, gigantic entities that made these wonderful cartoonish video games. But Tom Kalinski was the president of Sega of America from 1990 to 1996. And when I asked him naturally, hey, Tom, what did you do before you were at Sega? I quickly learned that other than my parents, he was the adult who most likely influenced the majority of my childhood. Out of college, he joined J. Walter Thompson, the advertising agency, and helped to develop the Flintstones Kids Chewable Vitamins.
Wow.
And then after that, he went to Mattel, and he joined shortly after Barbie had her first down year. Mattel didn't know if they were going to stop making Barbie or slower the pace or not really focus on Barbie anymore, but he was put in charge of that line, and he turned it into a $1 billion a year industry of her own. And then he was asked to do for boys what Barbie did for girls, and he helped develop He-Man, Masters of the Universe.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so it was like everything he said, and he says it so matter-of-factly, but also in a humble way. And I'm just like, Tom, that changed so much of my life. And it was just all these things. You know, he was involved with making Popples and other types of toys and games. He went to Matchbox after Mattel. But then in 1990, he was sort of at a crossroads. He had been passed over for the top job at Mattel, and he didn't really know what he was going to do next. And, you know, I think he was a little bit down on his luck, maybe wondering if his best years had passed him by, because those were some pretty good years that he had. And then out of nowhere, while he was on this family vacation with his wife and kids in Hawaii, Hayao Nakayama, the president of Sega Enterprises, found him on the beach and said, Tom, I would like for you to run Sega and take on Nintendo. And Tom said, I think, get out of the way, you're blocking the sun, and I don't know anything about video games, so I don't think that's a very good idea. And that sort of speaks to Tom's charisma and his self-deprecating, sarcastic nature. But, he had a talent, a magic touch for bringing ideas, sometimes odd ideas, to the masses in a way that really emphasized the inherent story value and the imagination. And he left his family vacation in Hawaii mid-trip, flew out to Tokyo with Nakayama, saw Sega's secret R&D lab, what they were developing, and he was really blown away. He thought, this could give me the ammo to take on Nintendo and pull off the impossible. And in hindsight, it seems like, of course, Sega would take on Nintendo and do well, or at least not even that, but another company would topple Nintendo. But if you think back, Nintendo was really dominant, and there wasn't necessarily a reason that they had to lose that market share. They had become so synonymous with video games that, in the way that jacuzzi is shorthand for hot tubs, Nintendo was that for video games.